Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank Crystal from MailChimp, Jen from Deloitte, and Lars from Amplify. We're going to talk about the bar for company culture. It's rising. The question is why? Among the many reasons, employees are burnt out, work-life balance continues to be out of whack. Clearly, we're a long way from equitable workplaces. And the result is that people are reevaluating everything about work: when they work, how they work, and maybe most important, why they work. So the way we work has to change, or employees will find what they need elsewhere. Jen, I want to begin with you. We've been talking about employee burnout for 2 years. It hasn't improved, and that tells us that work isn't working for people. What, in your opinion, do we need to do differently?
Employee burnout started and existed long before the pandemic. I think the pandemic exposed employee burnout and truly how bad it was. So I think that it also gave us the permission to talk about burnout, to talk about what we're going through, to talk about what we're feeling. And as we shift, some people going back to an office, hybrid, whatever is in between, I think we have a lot of things to figure out because we do know that it's not working. Rethinking things like, why do we meet? When do we meet? When do we come together in person? And what does that look like? What's the purpose of coming together in person? What type of work do we do when we're together versus when we aren't co-located or when we're apart? All of that needs to be rethought. But I think the key for every organization is you have to involve the workforce in these decisions. They are being loud and clear about that. They don't want these things to be decided without them or for them. And if you do decide without them and for them, and it's not something they agree with, we're seeing it happen, right? I mean, that's what the Great Resignation is all about. People are, they're leaving because they want to have a voice in the way that they work, and they want to work for organizations that care about them and care about what they think, care about who they are inside and outside of the workplace. And so I think, we've moved way beyond kind of work-life balance into how do we help people integrate the pieces of work and life that really matter to them. That also makes the workforce responsible for the company culture, right? It's not just set at the top, even though tone at the top and behavior at the top can either help reinforce culture or it can destroy it. But we all have a role to play when it comes to setting the culture that we want on our teams or within our larger organizations. And so I think it's important that people understand if you don't feel like you can affect big organizational culture, you can certainly affect your team culture, right? And we all have a role to play in that and how we treat each other, how we talk to one another, and the conversations that we have and the communications that we have with one another can, in a lot of ways, make or break, somebody's experience with an organization.
Lars, let me ask you this question. It has to do with employees increasingly valuing their time. Companies and even countries are testing the waters of a 4-day work week. I wonder, in your perspective, is this the next frontier for flex work? And if not, what is?
Yeah, Angela, I would say it's, part of what's so exciting about this time is there are so many frontiers. 4-day work week is certainly one of them. Jen touched on so many other points that I think are impacting the world of work today as we think about mental health and supporting employees and thinking about when, how, and where we work. So I think it's hard to pin down any one thing as being kind of the next frontier. And that's what makes this exciting and stressful at the same time. I think what we're going to see a lot of emphasis this year in particular, and likely next year as well, is what I frame as hybrid 2.0. In the early days of the pandemic, when many companies who were co-located shifted to remote, that happened overnight. And so essentially they ported their in-office operating rhythms, operating systems to digital. They still had, meetings that should have been emails. They still coordinated most of their work synchronously. They just did it digitally and synchronously. And so I think one of the next frontiers that you'll really see a lot of companies focus on is most companies who have quote unquote knowledge workers who are able to work remotely during the pandemic and continue to, they're hybrid by default, right? Offices will still exist. Some people will still be going back into an office, but most of those organizations are hybrid. And so we're going to get really intentional about hybrid, about being intentional about what work has to happen synchronously versus asynchronously. And so I think, this year and next the focus is going to be hybrid 2.0. We're definitely going to see more companies having 4-day work weeks. And I think that will continue to increase over the next couple of years. But again, we're not looking at any one thing. It's really a buffet of things that are changing in this new world of work.
Crystal, that brings me to a question that I've been wanting to ask you, which is about flexibility. It's clear employees want flexibility in where and when they work. That requires trust. How do you measure accountability and productivity without eroding trust? And are these at odds or not?
I love this question, Angela. And the first thing I'll say is productivity and accountability should never be at odds with trust. Because what we've learned by working virtually or in a hybrid environment in the past 2+ years is that in general, employee productivity has actually increased. And Jen mentioned this earlier, but prior to COVID-19, most tech cultures, including MailChimp, were almost predominantly working from the office. And it was this primary belief that we could better manage accountability and productivity by visibly seeing the work in action. And while there is an undeniable benefit of improving communication, collaboration, and belonging, the key ingredient to improving all of the above, and honestly in any working environment, is trust. And to me, trust is really engendered when there is clarity of expectations, when the employees have the flexibility to do the work the way they need to. And I would say another key part is really the empathy and the benevolence from leadership to acknowledge that current events or balancing home or caregiving priorities may impact employee productivity, and trusting their employees to get the work done when they need to. And at MailChimp, we're shifting from measuring outputs to measuring outcomes. And most companies have also moved toward quarterly check-ins or OKRs. This shift in mindset really requires building a new muscle, because we believe that with the help of leadership to connect to our teams, we need two-way communication about what's working and what's not, and giving new opportunities to adapt and check and adjust more frequently. To me, that builds trust. It improves communication, it improves team satisfaction, and ultimately productivity.
There would be then autonomy about how you're going to manage your time, your workflow, in order to achieve the objectives that everyone has agreed upon. So there's not going to be a kind of micromanagement, but the two-way trust that enables innovation and flexibility and so forth. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. And again, it starts with the why. It starts with setting the context of what we're trying to achieve. And if the end result is really about customers, which it is for MailChimp, we're giving our employees the flexibility and, to your point, the autonomy to manage the how the work gets done. But there's a common goal, there's a common mission on what it is we're trying to accomplish.
Jen, this brings me to a question that I think is all about, the two-way street of trust and clarity in an organization. And the question is, what can employees do to help create the culture they want to work in? Whose responsibility is it to help employees set boundaries, and how?
I want to say it's everyone's responsibility. The problem with saying that is when it's everyone's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility. So let me break it down. So if you are on a team that you don't feel like has the culture that you want to work in, and you want to help change that, talk to your colleagues. Put together some ideas, bring it to your leader, and say, these are what we want our team cultural norms and behaviors to look like. This is what we want it to be. My colleague and I on Phillips, we wrote a book called Work Better Together. And in our research for that book, what we found is that oftentimes where the power lies in creating culture is actually at the team level. That's where people live and work every single day. Those are the people that impact our well-being, whether it's positively or negatively every single day. It's not typically the large organizational leadership that impacts us on a day-to-day basis. Large organizational culture is really important, but the culture that affects us and impacts us every single day is on our team. And so if you don't feel like you have the right culture, don't just leave it up to your leader or blame your leader. We just have to give ourselves the permission to help change and impact the cultures that we work in.
Lars, what does the ideal workplace of the future look like if really the microculture of a team, if you will, can be at least as important as the overall organizational culture of the entire company.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the future workplace, this goes back to your question about frontiers. This is another frontier that we're in the process of building right now. You know, the majority of employees who have been working remotely want to stay working remotely at least part of the time. But I think when you look at how we need to be thinking about offices moving forward, it's much more of a communal space. It's a place where you go to build those relationships. It's a place where you go to collaborate, to communicate. You know, it's almost more of an index on that than actually doing work.
When working in our home offices, then the workplace does become, as you say, a place to develop relationships, a place to, talk to people in ways that you are not necessarily getting work done. And that insight leads me to a question for you, Crystal, which is about relationships and in particular about belonging. When it comes to belonging, it's pretty simple. Employees who feel a sense of belonging are much more likely to stay. Employees who don't feel a sense of belonging are much more likely to leave. How can we foster belonging at a time when employees, in many contexts, may not be interacting much with each other in person?
Yeah, well, this is a personal answer as well. You know, I'm one of 100 plus employees who joined MailChimp virtually during the pandemic. I can personally attest at how critical it is to find community and foster belonging virtually. And you're correct. You know, employees who are less likely to feel like they belong are 50% more likely to leave the organization. And so belonging is such an important attribute for measuring employee engagement and retention. And the fascinating thing about it is that you really need data to understand the sentiment on a granular level to create impact, because belonging is very, very personal. And so in 2020, MailChimp began attributing our employee engagement surveys and measuring belonging as a part of our culture index. And we learned that employees who, for example, worked outside of our Atlanta headquarters office were less likely to feel like they belonged. And so when I think about the employee experience holistically, it really starts with onboarding, right? It's true for all employees, regardless of your work preference, but especially when you're joining remotely or in a hybrid environment where half of your team is in a different location. And at MailChimp, we have an amazing employee experience team that measures the employee experience through life cycle surveys. And we design experiences with employees' needs in mind, to Lars's point. We have to design a new work environment for people to feel like they belonged. So we created a plan and we focused on 3 key areas. Number 1, building inclusive leadership, because the leader's mindset really needed to shift from how do you manage belonging in a very dynamic way with team members all over. The second is really partnering with our employee resource groups to understand the needs a bit more on a granular level, but also creating social connections with employees. And I would say the last thing we did was really, to Jen's point earlier, we have to establish new norms of what belonging means for the team. And you really want to co-create that with your team and not have a top-down approach.
This is the end of our conversation, but before you go, I have a question for each of you, and that is, we're seeing another round of back to the office announcements from companies, but we know most employees, as you point out, don't want to go back to pre-pandemic work life just exactly as it was. So the question is, what might be driving this push to return, and what's the merit and the risk? Are leaders trying to reuse a recipe for culture that has expired? And Crystal, I'd love to begin with you.
Well, I think the first part of the question is, I think we all in some ways want to feel some sense of normal, want to feel some sense of control based on what we've experienced the last 2+ years. And what I'll say to the reusing of the recipe is we have new ingredients. So leaders really need to think about what are the parameters we're working with now and recreate something completely different to meet the needs of the employee experience.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And Lars, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I love Crystal's comment on new ingredients. We're all nostalgic for a pre-pandemic world, but the reality is the world of work that existed in February of 2020 is gone forever. And so for leaders who are continuing to push to get back to that norms, they're going to feel a lot of pain as employees actually have lots of different choices now and options. And so I think eventually they're going to come around, but those who are really steadfast on pushing people back to office before they're ready, they're going to be on the front lines of this great resignation.
And finally, Jen, what's your perspective on this question?
I think what we need to all ask ourselves is, what was it that we liked about going to the office pre-pandemic? And what are those things that we want to go back for? We want to remember it as great, but there were a lot of things that weren't so great. So let's let go of those things. Let's remember what we liked about it and why we liked it, and carry those forward along with all the new recipes that we've learned and that we have to make the world of work a much better place for all of us going forward.
Jen, Crystal, and Lars, the themes in this panel have been so powerful. I hear that, this isn't just the great resignation. It's not even just the great reshuffling. It's the great reflection about the principles of human nature that have brought us to workplaces in the first place, but also that there is this possibility for experimentation as we reflect on why we do our work and how we work best. There is the possibility, especially if everybody has the autonomy to do this, to in some ways reinvent work as we move out of the pandemic. So I want to thank each of you for your invaluable perspectives, and I hope to see you again soon.